Good afternoon. I want to thank everybody who joins us in Ukraine Media Center Ukraine Forum, both online and offline. My name is Oleksandra Romantsova, and it's my pleasure to see all of you join us here. It's been almost 10 years of the war, and today's day 712 of the full-scale invasion of our homeland by Russian aggressor. And we have invited all of you today to discuss a very interesting and important topic. Today we are about to discuss the decision of the International Court of Justice of the United Nations on Ukraine's lawsuit, and we will talk about its consequences, since we have to understand, is it a positive and negative award for us? And to discuss this topic, we have invited Oleksandra Romantsova, human rights defender, executive director at the Center for Civil Liberties. And also joining us is Volodymyr Yavorskyy, lawyer, Yavorskyy, the stress is on the first syllable. So, human rights defender, program manager at Center for Civil Liberties. So we understand that on the 31st of January, we were witnesses of this award of the International Court of Justice of the United Nations as to discrimination of the indigenous people and financing on terrorism by Russian Federation. So again, let's start. What were the charges that we were pressing, and what were the conventions that we were using? So how should we perceive this current award? We've heard a lot of discussions by our experts, journalists who were expressing different opinions. Some were saying that it's a failure for us. Some were saying it's to some extent positive award. We were seeing the reaction of Russia, who recognized it as Ukrainians' loss. So what's going on really? First of all, thank you very much for this opportunity, for having me here. It's the new phase of having Ukraine included in the process of international justice. And here we have to talk why we are curious about it, why we are interested in it, because the Center for Civil Liberties documents the war crimes since 2014. And together with the Kharkiv Human Rights Group and Ukraine Helsinki Society, we have such an initiative that is called Tribunal for Putin, where we document the war crimes. And according to our calculations, there are more than 50,000 such war crimes committed in Ukraine, so almost 60,000 of them. See this systemic problem all the time, that the international crimes are committed in Ukraine, and all of the people in Ukraine are asking, where are those systems that are supposed to protect us? How can we get justice? And in fact, I like it a little bit that the journalists started sorting out that the problem that they already know, that there is no Hague Tribunal in The Hague, but there is like 5 different courts there. So International Court of Justice is an important forum because it's the court that unites all of the members of the United Nations, which reviews the responsibility and liability of the countries under all of the conventions that they signed. So you can, for example, Ukraine cannot press charges in Ukraine against Russia through that court if Russia is not a signatory of any of those conventions. So one convention that we use is the oppression of the indigenous people, and another is financing of terrorism. And we've submitted it before the invasion, and another set of charges were pressed with regard to invasion. Meanwhile, thus Russia was explaining that we bring our troops here because somewhere in Donbass a genocide of some Donbassian ethnos is being committed. So this second case is just handed over to be reviewed by the court, and there is an award with regard to the first set of charges, and Volodymyr, as a lawyer, can give us better detail about both two cases. So Mr. Volodymyr, why first of all we've picked these two conventions? Why did we choose this track? Why did we use them as the foundation? Did we exhaust all of the conventions? Did we use them comprehensively? So again, talking about the word of the court, do they have any positive and negative components? Well, in the international arena, Russia takes a defensive position. They don't recognize the international jurisdiction in international courts, or maybe just with regard to a very narrow set of conventions. So there are only two conventions, or three conventions, according to which a country can press charges against other countries without consent of Russia, because usually consent of Russia is required. For example, if Ukraine wants to press charges about the fact of aggression, Russia has to agree to that, and if Russia does not, Ukraine cannot do that, and this is why Ukraine advocates the creation of international tribunal, because there are no other legal instruments to do that. So we were thinking like, yeah, we have to do something, and talking generally, there is a number of cases in European courts for human rights where Ukraine presses charges against Russia. Those are very high scale and high profile cases, and there is also accusation of Putin in International Criminal Court with regard to the deportation of Ukrainian children. This case may be transformed into a case of genocide. We'll see how it develops, but it's very perspective, I would say, and there's a lot of other cases waiting to be reviewed there. Also, there were charges pressed by the individuals against Russia to the Committee of United Nations on Human Rights, on Discrimination, and other committees. So back in 2017, Ukraine pressed that first charges with that first case under the Convention Against Terrorism and Convention Against Racial and Discrimination of indigenous population. And basically, it regards those events that unfolded in Crimea and Donbass. And we had to prove that the rights of the Ukrainians and Crimean Tatars were severely violated there. And also Ukraine had to prove that Russia is a country that is involved in financing terrorism, which would automatically result in certain sanctions on a global level against Russia. But even later, that concept has changed a little bit as we started understanding that Donbass is yet another attempt of annexation of territory rather than financing of separatist groups, because those separatist groups were artificially created and fully controlled by Russia. So that first case has run to its end. It has both positive and negative sides. I would compare it to a rocket strike by Ukraine, where part of the rockets missed, part of the rockets were shot down, and part of the rockets hit the target. And we may say all the rockets missed, and we may focus on that fact. But shouldn't we have pressed any charges against Russia? We should have just nothing, or we could have nothing, and we could have the situation way worse than we have now. But again, if we dig deeper into details, okay, there are both positive and negative sides. So let's talk about the positive ones. We know that we were applying to the court with very powerful and intense cases. We were using the case with the Dutch aircraft that was downed and other very intense cases, as for example shelling of Mariupol, shelling of a bus in Volnovakha. Why didn't those cases help us to seek more positive, so to say, justice for us? There were many cases about the MH17. There was a court proceeding. There was a trial. So for us, for our population, we cannot understand what we should do to convince the global community that everything was supplied by Russia, that the book missile system was supplied by Russia, but at the same time the award is not the one that we expected to see. So the way that the court construed it, they narrowed it down. The convention is about prevention of financing of terrorism, and the court identified that the supply of weapons is not financing. And again, there is a contradiction, there is inconsistency about who was committing those acts. It was our claim with regard to the award in Netherlands. So was it Russia or was it some separatist formation supported by Russia? Those are two very different theories, in fact, and that theory, I think even Ukraine confuses it to a certain extent. There is one theory in one end and another one in another end, and I think it's positive that the court could recognize DPR and LPR as a different subject, which would complicate the legal proceedings against Russia, because basically they have a lot of evidences that it was Russia bringing their troops there, capturing Donbass. They were creating their authorities there. They were financing it all. So those are the pseudo creations of Russia that are under full control of Russian Federation. So in this sense, it's probably good that the court did not recognize that Russia was financing the terrorism, and on the other hand, that field of financing was narrowed down to the fact that supply of weapons is not financing, and this is basically a problem of this instrument, of this convention. And another problem that we were facing is the problem with evidences, because Ukraine was thinking we should only refer to the trial and we could avoid providing any specific evidences during the trial, and it would suffice. And in many cases, practically during all of this case of prevention of discrimination, Ukraine was facing this problem that court did not identify the evidences that confirmed the stance of Ukraine. So one thing is to claim something in the court, but yet another thing is to prove it. And when Ukraine provided some evidences as the reports on NGOs, they could not be serving as the evidence in the court. So we should have video materials, evidences, some specific books with Russian ideology, something that was laid as the foundation for those reports of NGOs. And Ukraine had very little such evidences, and it was the main problem in terms of underperformance of Ukraine, why we lost this case, because we worked very bad with the evidences, and it's a state-level problem because Ukraine does not invest in investigation. We don't investigate the Maidan cases, they are still in the courts. And those cases about persecution in Crimea, they are not investigated as well properly. And those are the efforts that we should invest more resources, and we should work more with NGOs. Back then, the state was not ready to work with the NGOs to the extent necessary back then. But there are also positive sides in this process, because even regardless of the fact that Russia was not recognized as the country which financed terrorism, still it was identified as the country which discriminates Ukrainians in Crimea. That's already a proven fact. It cannot be debunked. It's recognized by the International Court of Justice of the United Nations, probably only in the sphere of education, but we've already made that step, and Russia cannot say already that this is something that we've made up. And another problem is the persecution of the Crimean Tatars, and Majlis in particular is not recognized as persecution of indigenous population, because the court, they just identified Majlis as a NGO, not as a representative body of the whole nation. So we did not properly explain what Majlis is. We did not invest a lot of efforts in this problem. So again, this problem with the Convention of Racial Discrimination, I think that it's a problem of Ukrainian evidences. We've taken the evidences seen very superficially. And talking about terrorism, we've invested more efforts, but we had some problems with proving our position. Well, many of your colleagues say that it's positive that everybody understands, based on the awards of the International Court of Justice of the United Nations, Russia is recognized as a violator of international humanitarian law. That's an axiom. Is it really so? And what are the consequences of this fact, and how we can use it in our advantage in the subsequent trials? Well, there will be no serious legal consequences. We can just continue pressing Russia as to the education system, because here the field is open for us. As long as the court identified that there is discrimination of Ukrainians in education sphere, we can continue update this case. There can be a systemic development, but it all depends on the Ukrainian party. But this award has a political role. This is the first award made under this convention, and it's important that Ukraine has made this step, that we've got this award. But another side of it is political. In the United Nations, we have a lot of things that are obvious for us, but for some 2/3 of the countries of the United Nations, those things are not so clear and obvious. It's difficult to push the Ukrainian agenda for African, South American, or Asian countries, South Asian countries, because they don't understand it. And when there is the award made by the International Court of Justice of the United Nations about the discrimination, they all see that there is no problem with the Ukrainian side. They understand that we did not violate the international law. It expands our capabilities in terms of influence on Russia. So in your opinion, continuation of this case of discrimination, it can be logical, and it would be logical that it will be complemented by Ukraine to be reviewed further on. Yes, absolutely. On top of that, now there are more cases reviewed in the United Nations Committee on Racial Discrimination, and in the Human Rights Committee there are cases reviewed with regard to Ukraine, and in the European Court for Human Rights, and it will all complement this trace of total discrimination of Ukrainians. And I hope there will be more evidences with regard to discrimination of Crimean Tatars. Well, talking about the terrorist financing, do we understand that we don't have a lot of prospects here? Because in fact, the supply of the weapons by Russia, the movement of troops over there by Russia, is not something that can be regarded by this convention. We should rather, in that case, show some bank accounts to demonstrate that it was terrorism financing, but definitely we don't have any access to such accounts, and it means that we do not have any prospects in terms of this convention. Well, I want to emphasize what Volodymyr was saying. We should not recognize LDPR as terroristic organizations that were financed by Russia or can be financed by Iran, for example, as we see other examples in the Middle East. So in this case, the idea is that Ukraine can insist that those people who represent themselves as the so-called LDPR are an integral part of all this Russian aggression, and they're not financed by Russia. They're included in Russian budget. This is a whole different theory, and it can have its developments. So we don't view them as the terroristic organizations financed by Russia, and they should be condemned, but we can condemn them as the representatives of Russian Federation. So, you know, those legal nuances here, when we talk about the international assessment of terrorism, it's a new sphere where the Geneva Conventions are not developed so well with regard to financing of terrorism, and these conventions which contain the definition of what terrorism is, but what to do if a whole state acts as a terrorist state. So in this area we have certain prospects, and Ukraine can be not only a user of the existing documents, existing instruments with regard to which we were applied to the court, but a country that can be, so to say, a pusher, uh, a trailblazer here. So we have some options for development here as well. Well, it's not a secret for anybody that there were a lot of talks. Our experts were saying that we had way more hopes with regard to convention on discrimination of indigenous population. We had more evidences there. We've invested more efforts in that part, but the award is as it is, and some might say that such an award complicates the issue of human rights. Do you see any such consequences? Well, it would complicate the things only if Ukraine refuses to undertake any legal actions further on. For example, if we say that United Nations is worthless, we don't have to do anything else. We have to revoke all of the cases from international courts, and it's only the armed forces that will save us. So I know a lot of people in Ukraine who are inclined to think so, but it will complicate things for us because it will contain no restrictions for Russia. As I've said, there is a lot of trials in other institutions of United Nations, Committee for Human Rights, Committee for Racial Discrimination, European Court for Human Rights, and so on, where all those cases will be reviewed as well, and we will continue defending our people, because I think Ukraine is supposed to defend the people who ended up in occupation using all of the available legal mechanisms. So in this case, yes, we failed to prove it, but I think that the government will just draw proper conclusions from this case. They will be prepared to read better, but they will not leave this case alone. So in this context, there is nothing that prevents us to press charges again under this convention, but if there are new circumstances, Ukraine can press charges again, and we can get prepared even better in the following case. But again, this case was initiated in 2017, but in 2017 the level of sanctions against Russia was absolutely different. It was a different dimension, so to say, than now after the beginning of the full-scale invasion. So we view this case as a little bit incomplete, but we're talking about the things that existed 7 years ago, the situation that existed way before. Well, let's talk about another case. Many people, even in Ukrainian society, do not understand it, because we understand that Ukrainians cannot comprehend why do we dispute that it wasn't Ukraine who committed genocide. Meanwhile, we're all convinced that Russia, with regard to Ukraine, commits genocide. Why did we submit this specific? Why did we file this specific case? Why this wording? Well, in the international law, the attack can happen in 3 cases. First, it's the act of aggression, well, because there are no legal grounds for such actions. Another is the act of self-defense. For example, Ukraine attacks Russia. And third is to prevent genocide. And Russia was working for 8 years. They were bombarding everybody with propaganda, with information about genocide of Russian speakers in Donbass. They had a very serious campaign all over the world. And if you watch the address of Putin in the beginning of special military operation, his argument is that he starts the special military operation to stop genocide in Donbass. That was legal grounds for him to initiate those military operations. This is why Ukraine filed that case to the court to have it recognized that there is no genocide of any Donbass people in Donbass. It's all made up, it's propaganda, and it automatically entails legal recognition of unacceptability of all that military operations against Ukraine. So Russia changed its propaganda after that. In their propaganda, they started developing another topic of self-defense against NATO. And it's very bright, it's very demonstrative in this propaganda. But again, the court will destroy all those claims because they have to prove that NATO was a threat to us. So basically, this is how we clear the way for our defense against Russia in legal sphere, because they will be deprived of all of the legal instruments to defend themselves. This is why Ukraine wanted to get everything in terms of this genocide case. So Ukraine was saying that since the accusations of genocide are untrue, Russia is supposed to pay reparations for all of their activities, and the court said we cannot do this because, yes, even if we recognize that their actions were in compliance with conventions on genocide, to identify actions of Russia as aggression, we have to prove that it was not self-defense, and it has a more broad meaning, and court said that we have a limited jurisdiction and we cannot review this case. Some started saying that Ukraine would not get reparations, but it's a failure. But it's not so, because the way to reparations is still open. The court is about to come up with the award on the genocide in the eastern part. The court said that Russia is supposed to stop the military operation, but Russia did not comply with those requirements, so there is a way to compensation under this case, and it will all depend on the preparations on the legal side by Ukraine. But doesn't it tell us that after this case we should press more charges, we should file another claim saying that we want to debunk this self-defense thing by Russia? Well, it cannot be debunked. We cannot file to the court against Russia because Russia has to accept the jurisdiction of international courts, and they will never do that. And this is why all over the world Ukraine is clearing the platform. This is why we need this special tribunal for aggression, because currently there are no legal mechanisms using which Ukraine as a state can protect itself against the act of aggression, and this tribunal with regard to aggression should solve this first case. They should state that yes, there is a fact of aggression, but to do this they have to identify that it's no self-defense. And in the legal community, many might say that as soon as this case ends up in international courts, Russia has no arguments that it uses self-defense, but in fact they don't have any arguments like this, because to perform self-defense you have to have somebody attacking you, but there is nobody attacking Russia. But even if we take the case of Russia against Georgia, there was a fact of attack of Georgian forces on those lands, and in our case it did not happen, so we were acting in a civilized way, and it plays to our advantage now. And on the legal side we are on the winning track, and this is why we have to seek this aggression tribunal establishment. Thank you very much, dear colleagues. Do we have any questions on the floor? You're kindly invited to join our conversation. Well, now there is some feeling, you know, that the war going on now demonstrates those problems that not all of the instruments in the international law that are efficient. So don't you have this feeling as well? What do we have to do to make sure that the international law works with all those existing problems like financing of terrorism that does not contain only the physical transfer of money from one account to another, but it involves way more things? Well, we have to look for our place there. Unfortunately, after year 91, Ukraine continued to just moving along the Soviet track. With regard to many international organizations, we were trying not to interfere when there was some serious voting. So now Ukraine has a chance to change their position and to be a part of restoration of this global security architecture. It would be of advantage to Ukraine in terms of our relations with South American, African, or South Asian countries, because previously Europe was discussing it by discussing within the Council of Europe, and they were excluding themselves from United Nations in this way, like United Nations existed for all other countries but Europe. And now we found out that we need diplomatic ties with Europe, Canada, USA, and on top of that we need the diplomatic ties with more than 100 other countries of the world, because there are interests of Russia there are interests of Ukraine there, and all of the international law is based on the conventions, on the agreements. We're talking about these conventions now, so they were made, they were written, and then the partner countries were joining those conventions, and the more convention is ratified by the more countries, the better those rules work for all of the countries. And Ukraine can be an activist in this regard to work on this, but we have to continue working. We have to invest resources. We have to have the young diplomats choose this area as area of their professional interest. We have to have legal specialists involved in the process. I would like to add that international institutions, international law is the reflection of the will of the countries. All of the global world order is based on one concept of sovereignty of the states. So without the consent of a country, no one should interfere in my business, in my affairs. We can treat it good or bad, but Ukraine was always supporting this way of things. All of the countries do support it, and there is no better order invented so far. And it continued working just until the very moment before the United Nations Security Council ended in the dead end, when one of the permanent members of the Security Council started neglecting all of the existing rules and procedures. So before that it was a so-called diplomatic war through proxy wars or some other things like that, but now there is an open conflict which demonstrates to the whole world that international law doesn't work here. But we should find a way out of this situation, and there is no consensus about how to do this. There are big countries who do not want to be managed by small countries, and democracy is impossible here to a certain extent, but how to do it? Now there's a lot of discussions around that, and Ukraine is supposed to protect it with all means possible, because first of all it ensures our support in the West by the countries which support us, and secondly it establishes the guarantees of our protection for future, because sooner or later we have to find the solution how a small country can defend itself against a bigger country, against of aggression made by bigger country, or we continue seeing other big countries attacking more smaller countries, or we create some mechanism. So, Mr. Volodymyr, we understand the challenges that international law is experiencing now. But on the other hand, you said that our country and all of the institutions are underperforming. We're a little bit behind our homework. So what should we do to improve this evidences collection to prove those crimes committed? What should we do? So first of all, we have to establish a special institution that would be tasked with collecting evidences regarding the international crimes. We have more than 100,000 of them. If we establish this institution today, they will be busy for the next 10 years. If we do not create this institution, those crimes will be never investigated. And 90%, at least 90% of those cases. And to do that, we have to have proper investigative bodies. We have to continue cooperating on a diplomatic field. We have to be proactive. And let me remind you about one example. For example, Ukraine has a case with International Criminal Court. There is an award, there is a warrant for arrest of Putin, and we have not ratified the Rome Statute. In fact, we do not recognize it. But on top of that, since 2014, we are as an associated member of this court, but there was no single time. We don't even have a representative of a diplomatic corps who would be taking part in the trials of this court. So Ukraine is just absent in ICC. We don't even have a responsible person in MFA who would be in charge of cooperation with ICC. And this non-proactive position in such international organizations is surprising. It cannot yield any result. Russia takes a proactive position everywhere. They're present in every single international body. Moreover, they promote their representatives everywhere. They try to put their NGOs everywhere who provide their evidences. They bring their media, their mass media. It's a huge machine that works all over the world. And we have to work at least in a diplomatic field. We have to increase the budget and we have to make our stance more proactive. Thank you very much. We have questions on the floor. Ukrinform, Marina Kožuhar. I would like to just ask for more details. What exactly are the claims that Ukraine has to file to get the reparations that we were talking about earlier? Well, for the time being, a case of genocide will be heard by the court, then the European Court for Human Rights will be hearing to the cases too, but there are two more conventions under which Ukraine can file more claims against Russia to demand reparation. Is the Convention for Prevention of Torture and Convention Against Violent Abductions. Those are the two conventions that Ukraine has not used so far. We did not file any claims under those conventions, but we were supposed to do that. On top of that, Ukraine can file additional claims under the convention against racial discrimination. And another bigger aspect will be the Special Tribunal of Aggression. It's the key task for Ukraine because the major part of reparations that Ukraine can get, it can come from that international tribunal. I would like to thank you for this comprehensive conversation. It's really holistic and important. Thank you for explaining to us some complicated things that regard the construing of international law. I would like to thank our listeners and spectators for the interest to this topic, and we continue working together for our victory. We want to thank our security and defense forces. Glory to Ukraine!